Hello, welcome. Today we'll discuss formulating an intelligence-driven threat hunting methodology, going from hunting theory to hunting practice. My name is Joe Slowik. I'm a threat intelligence manager for Huntress, where I'm responsible for not just cyber threat intelligence, but also guiding and leading our threat hunting and detection engineering operations, a relationship that will become very clear as we move through the material today. Our agenda in this recording is first to describe or define threat hunting. Once we have an idea of what threat hunting means, we will then move into the prerequisites for hunting and get to conceptualizing a hunting process. We'll flesh this understanding out with some examples and then have some concluding thoughts for where threat hunting fits into the broader security landscape and how it can assist more regular or standardized security workflows. First, defining threat hunting. Certainly, many people and organizations talk about and refer to threat hunting, but seldom do we get a very rigorous definition of what that process means. So when looking at threat hunting, certainly we are talking about some sort of active process and looking for and engaging threats, but how does that look in practice? There are a variety of vendor-specific definitions of hunting, examples from entities such as CrowdStrike, as well as from the SANS Institute, which certainly can be valid, but may have very particular emphasis on certain products and procedures. For this discussion, we're going to take a broader view of threat hunting that is agnostic to specific solutions and really look at threat hunting as a process that starts by assuming that we will miss intrusions. Not everything will be caught by existing security processes, whether that's detections or security operations center analysis. And we will then support the security operations center or SOC by identifying those adversaries that made it through our existing detection and visibility set. In doing so, we can supplement automated detections and other tools through human-in-the-loop processes to identify activity of interest that relates to adversary action. So that's all well and good, but what is it that we actually need in order to engage in a threat hunting practice? First, from a threat hunting perspective, yes, we want to start with a threat hunt, but in order to execute that properly, we have to have questions to answer as well as the visibility that allows us to then formulate answers to those questions or hypotheses. Going a level deeper, questions can consist of just asking yourself or using our understanding of the threat environment to ask what are threat actors doing and what technical observations exist that align with those threat actor behaviors or actions, which gets us into the visibility area where we want to determine how does the adversary look within our own telemetry set. Based upon what technical observations this adversary will leave behind, where in my visibility would those observations manifest, or how do I find those? Leading to the question of can I or can I not identify adversary actions within the data sources that are available to me? So that sounds good, but may be a little confusing because this is still taking matters at a 10,000-foot level, so to speak. Diving into this a little bit deeper, we need to start with some understanding of the adversary. A lot of the threat hunting process, at least as articulated in this presentation, is grounded on knowing and understanding how adversaries operate. But we don't stop there. We also need to understand the query and search ability that's available to us within the data sources that are available so that we can go look for what artifacts are left behind by given adversaries, and then marry that to our telemetry and data sources that we interact with. And as you might guess, all three of these items are mutually reinforcing, with an understanding of the adversary guiding what queries and searches we need to execute, so long as we have an understanding of where telemetry and data will enable us to identify those adversaries or the actions of those adversaries. This process, or rather this set of activities, forms the basis and the foundation of a successful and viable threat hunting program. Beginning with data and understanding, we need to certainly understand threats, but we also need to understand our visibility. Failure to do so will set us up for failure. Finally, we need to understand our ability to search and interrogate that visibility based upon what we understand of given threats. So in looking at threats, we need to understand what artifacts exist related to threats, what their behaviors leave behind. That means the technical artifacts left behind by threat actor operations and potentially threat actor goals and objectives. That can be very hard to determine, but may be sufficient just in identifying, do I have an adversary that's engaging in disruptive operations or ransomware operations or similar? With that understanding behind us, we can then move into understanding, what can I see? What data sources are available, and is there a certain time sensitivity to the observations? For example, do I have 24 hours worth of data that I can interrogate that presents a significant limiter on the sorts of threat hunts that I can execute? Or do I have a year's worth of data that I can interrogate to look for signs of adversary activity? Or am I blending the two between different data sources depending upon what sort of questions that I'm asking? Once I can properly scope that visibility, then I need to determine, how do I query that data to effectively search for activity of interest? What sort of queries can I create and pursue? This can go from very simple sorts of searches based upon specific technical indicators to complex nested queries that take outputs of initial questions that then get fed into subsequent discussions to come up with a more enriched picture of what is happening within our monitored environment. What we want to avoid is hunting in isolation, simply looking in the dark and hoping that we spot something based upon very limited visibility and not having a lot of data to interrogate or search through. By improving visibility and adding context, we're still left somewhat in darkness because we'll never have complete visibility over our environment for cost or time-bound reasons, but we could at least expand the aperture of what we can see to come up with a broader perspective on what's going on in order to hunt down and identify adversary actions within our environment. In building a hunting process, we want to take this understanding of adversary data and query capability and start putting this together into something more formal. Certainly, if we wanted to develop a model, we could take a very rigorous and scientific approach like we see in matters like hypothesis testing for formal statistics. While this would be ideal if we could properly execute on this, such actions are also very hard and likely beyond the scope and means of many organizations and analysts. Instead, we should at least look for a realistic model that aligns with our capabilities and the resources available at hand. That means understanding how adversaries operate, as already stated, understanding the visibility that's available to us, and combining that with something we have not discussed so far, which is understanding risks to the organization. From this, we can then develop informed hunting hypotheses that deal with what we can see, what matters in what we can see, and how such actions may relate to critical organizational functions and the ability to operate. So in looking at hunting hypothesis criteria, we need to come up with items that are reasonably specific, that are limited in their scope so that we are asking questions that can be answered in a discrete fashion, that are measurable and that we can produce data that we can analyze and understand and have some means of assessing the completeness or accuracy of the results that come back, that we're asking questions that are detectable within the environment that we're operating, that take into account the visibility we have and the questions that we can ask of the environment, that are relevant to threat actors as they operate. So not asking questions about theoretically what might a threat actor do, but rather focused on what threat actors are actually doing and that may be relevant to the environment we're trying to defend. Timely in the sense that we are also looking for behaviors that are representative of the now as opposed to historical adversary operations. So not dwelling in history, but staying current with events and actions. And finally, testable in the sense that once we begin putting together an idea of what we want to ask, what we want to know, and how we think we will go after threats in our environment, that we can ask a question that comes back with actual results so that we can test the validity of the hypothesis of adversary activity we put together. Looking at the components of hunting hypotheses, we start with adversaries if we are adopting an intelligence-driven approach. That means understanding adversaries as consisting of threats in the operating space. Who are the bad guys that are out there in the world right now? But also understanding threat operations in general and their tendencies. What sort of tools and techniques do we observe in threat space as applied to victims and organizations that are at the mercy of such threat actors? And finally, how do we take this understanding to learn the behavioral aspects of adversary operations, not grabbing and searching for very discrete one-off observations of adversary activity like we would see in, say, an indicator or indicator of compromise, but how can we generalize from what a specific observation tells us to a behavior that can capture additional instances or variations of that activity that may manifest in our own environment? Now, there are a variety of ways of understanding adversary operations. You can take a very theoretical and formal approach, such as mapping adversary actions to something like the diamond model of intrusion analysis, or performing a MITRE attack mapping, or similar study to flesh out our understanding of what an adversary is and how they operate. Or we can take a very technical approach and just look for what sort of tools and techniques our adversary is employing, such as, do I have a threat landscape that's dominated by a specific set of tooling or capability, such as Cobalt Strike, PSExec, Mimikatz, etc., and how does that look within my environment? Irrespective of which approach we choose, the key takeaway is that we come up with some means of understanding and researching our adversaries to yield those observables that we could then use to engage in a hunting practice. From an intelligence-driven perspective, what we're looking for is first identifying which adversaries are of interest, and then understanding how those adversaries operate on a technical level. From that, we can then start inferring potential adversary goals and intentions based upon the capabilities deployed. Do I have an extortion actor, a ransomware actor, an espionage actor that is trying to extract secrets from my environment, and how is that reflected in the tools and capabilities that are deployed? All of this comes together to formulate an understanding of what adversaries are or may be doing in my environment, and can then guide the questions that we ask of the available data to go look for signs of such adversaries that may have been missed in existing processes and detections. Which gets us to the next component of hypothesis formulation, which is telemetry. Essentially, we're looking for what sensors do I have and what activity can I see, which leads us to understanding how can I identify behaviors of interest? Do I have robust endpoint detection and monitoring that allows me to see process execution, parameters passed to individual commands, and so forth? Or am I limited to something as abstract as, say, netflow data, where I can understand and see that network connections exist, but I'm limited to the size, duration, and port numbers associated with that connection with no understanding of content? Or do I exist somewhere in between these extremes, depending upon the tools that I've deployed and what data is available to me? This will have a very determining effect on what sort of questions I can ask based upon my understanding of adversary operations. In looking at visibility and telemetry, we can certainly take an approach of the pew-pew map of just trying to understand where the threats are coming from and so forth, which may seem interesting and useful, but arguably is less than ideal and not especially helpful for day-to-day security operations. More relevant and likely is we can dig into the tools that are available to us, such as our SIMs or search consoles and the data and logs that are available to us, and query these for artifacts related to the adversaries we've researched based upon the sources of data that are available to us. Importantly, we need to understand that no organization on the face of this planet has complete visibility over their environment, whether because they lack sensors, traffic is encrypted, or adversaries themselves may wipe or eliminate certain sources of data. But importantly, we as defenders need to understand where those visibility gaps exist and then leverage existing tools and telemetry to try to address or compensate for those gaps to the greatest extent possible. That means understanding what gaps exist and then trying to determine ways of making up for them in some sort of fashion. Maybe I don't have visibility into encrypted network traffic streams, which is very understandable, but can I compensate for that by having more complete host visibility that allows me to see what websites or what network connections were created by a given host and use that to compensate for the lack of visibility on the wire. Finally, for creating hypotheses, we need to have in mind organizational value, purpose, and function. What this means is just understanding what purpose does the organization serve. That might seem very simple, but it's important to note that few, if any, organizations exist primarily to provide a secure network. Rather, organizations exist to provide a service or produce a good or some other function that customers, consumers, or constituents then utilize. From that understanding, we then need to ask how the organization's primary missions can be impacted by threat actors, because that will define the critical activities that we need to pay attention to the most. Once we have an understanding of this sense of criticality, we can start determining the most significant risk scenarios that threat actors can present to the organization we're defending, focusing on those scenarios that are most critical to the survival and continued function of the entity that we are trying to support. This sense of self-understanding is a type of intelligence that is seldom reflected within the landscape, unfortunately, but is critical in coming up with a viable, sustainable threat hunting as well as threat intelligence process. Because we must know the organization defended, which drives us to orient resources to specific threats. We can't cover everything. We just don't have the time, resources, et cetera, to do so. So instead, we need to orient ourselves and our operations to the threats that pose the most significant risk to our organization and what we're trying to defend. Through this process, we can learn points of focus and emphasis, such as identifying critical network pathways, critical functions within the organization that need to be preserved to the best that we can in order to ensure the continued operation and sustainment of the organization we're trying to support. All of this comes back to understanding that resources are limited and hunting activity can be a very open-ended process without engaging in a very rigorous thought process of figuring out what is critically important, what do I need to focus on. And so having this understanding of organizational value and criticality can keep us from going off the rails, so to speak, and pursuing threats that may be very real, but may be very tangential or unrelated completely to the entity that we are trying to defend and protect. So in putting all of this together, our hunting hypothesis consists of several interlocked components. Understanding the relevant adversary behaviors, what threat actors are doing right now in order to victimize organizations, understanding the risks that the organization faces relevant to those threat actors, and then based upon this, coming up with ways of identifying behaviors of interest in the data sources that are available to us. Putting all of that together allows us to come up with hunting hypotheses that are effective and match the criteria that we put forth previously in being specific, testable, measurable, and actionable within the environments we are supporting. So that's all well and good, but what does this actually look like in practice and not in theory? So from looking for hunting, we can certainly just go out there and try to be very quiet and go out and try to hunt rabbits, but instead we want to be a little more focused. So for example, we can take a very simple instance, although for a very serious threat, of business email compromise. We can adopt an example where business email compromise focused adversaries attempt to extract financial value from an organization by spoofing or injecting into legitimate communication channels. We can identify this activity through email headers and a lack of proper signatures and DKIM on emails. Within this statement, we see several things. We've identified a threat and how it operates, business email compromise entities that are manipulating or capturing email communications in order to actualize their threat that lead to an impact scenario of trying to extract financial value from the victim organization, and then using specific observables around email activity to try to find signs of this behavior within the telemetry available to us. Now, certainly if we're not capturing email logs or exchange logs or similar, depending upon your environment, these may be questions that you can't answer. And so it will be necessary to figure out alternative routes of approaching the problem. But the central idea of identifying threat, impact, and then how to identify or how to capture that threat scenario within available data is what we are striving for in coming up with a threat hunting program. But we can get more complex, and for this, we could look at examples such as ransomware operations. For an example to drive this discussion, we could look at something from the DFIR report about using malicious ISO files as an initial infection vector, leading ultimately to domain-wide compromise and then ransomware deployment. In this case, we see many behaviors. We see phishing with a malicious attachment, attachments that leverage alternative data formats in order to avoid mark of the web bypasses or to bypass mark of the web controls that would prohibit certain file types like macro-enabled documents from executing properly. Leveraging scripting and living off the land binaries to blend into the victim environment and avoid antivirus and other forms of detection. Similarly, using tools like Run DLL 32 and RegServer 32 for execution purposes to continue to blend into the environment and avoid static and even some forms of dynamic detection within the victim environment. Leveraging common tools like Cobalt Strike and Iced ID for prosecuting operations and getting into the network in question, and using name pipe impersonation in order to escalate privileges within the environment. Lots of behaviors here that we can talk about and that we can look for signs of, and that can lead to multiple potential hunting hypotheses to explore and interrogate the environment that we are defending. So, for example, we can take simple statements to identify compromise, such as, with sufficient host telemetry, identify anomalous processes and file chains indicating script execution leading to subsequent actions in binary execution. So identifying PowerShell, WScript, or something similar resulting or being called by an unknown or atypical process leading to the execution of a follow-on process or the download of a binary file of some sort. That can be a potential avenue to explore things that may have been missed through automated detections. Alternatively, we could look for persistence attempts by trying to identify newly scheduled task activity where the task binary in question is located in a suspicious or unusual area of the system. Seeing a newly registered scheduled task on a victim machine that is mapped to a binary in app data local temp under a given user account. Not necessarily completely unheard of, but certainly suspicious enough to merit further investigation if it's identified as part of the threat hunting process. There are certain considerations that have probably come to mind as we've gone through this more complex example. For example, there's lots of use of words like new and unusual and similar, and that can be very problematic because it requires us understanding the environment we're defending in order to really assess what is a new or unusual process or observation. That makes it very difficult to try to automate and standardize these sorts of questions, absent very complex systems that can be very proactive or very effective in mapping out network states and functionality. Thus, sustainability, or taking human-in-the-loop individual hunting exercises and translating them into automated repetitive tasks that can be done by a machine, requires a bit more work, and something that we'll discuss in our conclusions, which brings us to our conclusions. So we have to ask ourselves, what's next? Okay, so we engage in some threat hunting, something happens, and we achieve security. But what happens in this midpoint is what we need to focus on to close out this discussion. First and foremost, and tied into the final thoughts that we had on the previous section, we want to avoid repetitive hunting. If we're asking the same question multiple times, we have to look at that as being a failure in existing systems and functions that we require an individual to perform the same tasks over and over to try to identify potential threats in the environment. Thus, we need to look at hunting as a process, one that requires us to evaluate the effectiveness of a given hunt. Was it successful? Was it not successful? Did it yield results? Or if it did not yield results, could it yield results if we actually caught the behaviors that we were looking for as part of that hunting activity? And then transition successful hunts into detection humans, taking the human out of the loop and taking a successful hunt and migrating it in such a way that it now forms a part of our overall detection stack. That allows us to build sustainable, continuous monitoring of environments without having to burn individuals out by asking the same questions over and over and processing the resulting data in manual fashion. So in looking at threat hunting, it has a very dynamic relationship with the process of or function of detection engineering. Detections fundamentally determine the security baseline and posture of our organization, while threat hunting supplements our automated or standard security practices, but also works to inform detections by alerting our detection engineers as to what was missed or what it is that we failed to capture in automated processes. As a result, these items should be mutually reinforcing, with detections identifying or communicating gaps that we could use to hunt in from the hunting perspective, while the outputs of successful and even potentially failed hunts then go back to the detection team to inform future detection development and deployment. And this process could run for an infinite number of cycles as we continue to adapt to and identify adversary operations. To conclude with some final thoughts, we need to understand our adversaries first and foremost. Absent adequate and continued threat intelligence analysis, we are left guessing for what sort of behaviors and activities we need to look for. Once we've satisfied that, we need to understand our own visibility and monitoring practices to scope out just what it is that we can see and what it is that we can understand within our environment, as well as what questions we can ask. At that point, we can start developed informed hunting by leveraging our understanding of our own environment and what adversaries are doing to come up with relevant, accurate, testable hunting hypotheses for the defended environment, and finish this by capturing successful hunts and doing the best that we can to transition these into detections of some sort that will maintain the long-term security and viability of our environment. Please feel free to contact me through my Huntress email account or contact anyone from Huntress for further questions about threat hunting as a practice or how Huntress engages in this sort of activity to protect our own clients.